Now, despite the execution of the emperor, the sons managed to get away. One of the sons, the one in line for the throne, finds support eventually, right, over time. He finds support with Yamana Sozin and becomes known as the Emperor of the West. Now, some of you who are familiar with history may have heard of Yamana Sozin, and you may have heard of the Emperor of the West. Now, this is a kind of a contested historical point, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in the video a little later. But the fact is that the southern emperors became the Emperor of the West. Now, it's also taught that Yamana Sozin was seriously considering pushing for this son, for this Emperor of the West, to take the throne from the northern line if Yamana Sozin had won the Onin War. Now, Yamana did not win the Onin War, and the Emperor of the West had to relocate. But if Yamana Sozin had won the Onin War, he would have put the southern emperor back on the throne. Now, the war was actually more of an internal conflict between the Yamana and the Hosokawa, and the Hatakeyama house was divided, and one half of the Hatakeyama was fighting the other half of the Hatakeyama. But had the western side won, had the Yamana won, they would have then usurped the other side, the Hosokawa and the other, etc., and they would have usurped the Ashikaga. It would have led to a massive overhaul of the government, and they would have put the southern emperor on the throne. But they did not win the Onin War. Basically, the Hosokawa won, so that didn't happen. So, because the western faction lost the Onin War, the western emperor, his family, and his retainers all flee to the Ichinomiya area of Owari, which you would know now as northern Nagoya. So, the city Nagoya in Aichi Prefecture, northern Nagoya, the Ichinomiya area north of Nagoya. This is where the southern emperor went to with his family and his retainers. This southern imperial line had been using the name Kumano, or Kumano no Miya, and once they're in Owari, they change it to Kumazawa. Now, I have to point out that many modern-day historians claim that nobody knows who or what happened to the Western Emperor, and this is categorically false. This is a ridiculously false statement to make. Ample evidence has existed for centuries that the Western Emperor was the Kumano no Miya, right? Kumano no Miya Emperor that became the Kumazawa. So that claim that nobody knows who they were, what happened to them, again, categorically false. There's evidence for hundreds of years as to what happened. So with that, let's answer some of those questions. So, what is the Southern Court? The Southern Court is the Daikakuji line. The Southern Court is the true court, the court that actually should have been in control of Japan from the 1300s onwards, except for the sort of treason of the Ashikaga and the treason or weakness of the Jimyoin line. Who are the Southern Court loyalists? Well, simple. They're the ones who fight to reinstate the true order of imperial power, the Daikakuji, onto the throne. They started in the 1300s, but they ended with the treaty. They started anew in the 1400s, and it's been going to the present day. Now, some people have broken this up between the Southern Court and the Second Southern Court, but historically speaking, the concept of Second Southern Court is more of a modern creation. It's just been known as the Yoshino-cho or the Nancho, either the Yoshino Court or the Southern Court. There's no real need to add go to it because historically nobody ever conceived of it as the go Nancho, really, as the Second Southern Court. Just Nancho, Southern Court, or Yoshino-cho, the Yoshino Court. Now, Kusunokiru, now on this slide I forgot to mention the Tada part. So here's the Tada part. The Tada Genji serve the Southern Court. Most, if not all, now not every single Tada Genji descendant sided with the Southern Court, but most of them did. The main Tada line, the family name where they actually use the family name Tada, they serve the Southern Court. Many others, Tada Genji, samurai, even though they don't use the name Tada, but they are Tada Genji. They descend from Genji Yorimitsu and Genji Mitsunaka and his son Genji Yorimitsu. Most of them are serving the Southern Court. Many of them are actually fighting as Southern Court loyalists in the 1400s. So that's where the Tada Genji and the Southern Court crisscross. They also cross with Kusunoki-ryu, right? The Kusunoki-ryu, the traditions of the Kusunoki family, as we said, the Kusunoki family fight as Southern loyalists from the 1300s onwards. And many of the key loyalists are generals. Many of these key loyalist generals in the 1400s and 1500s were Kusunoki. One of the biggest Kusunoki names in the 1400s is Kusunoki Masahide. He's one of the key Southern Court loyalist generals at the time. Now, remember, Kusunoki tradition is also based partially on Tada Genji tradition. So Kusunoki, the founder of the tradition, Masashige, is a student of the Tada Genji tradition. He's a student also of the Oe Genji tradition. So that's also where Tada Genji comes in, to the Southern Court loyalist. And lastly, I told you I would show you where the shinobi or the ninjutsu, the shinobi no jutsu comes in. Much of the Southern Court loyalist tactics involve guerrilla warfare, of which shinobi and ninjutsu, shinobi no jutsu, makes up a large portion of the tactics. In fact, you'll watch my video on what is shinobi, you'll see that the Southern Court and Kusunoki concept of shinobi might actually be unique to the Southern Court loyalist. Now let's go ahead and end this video, but let's end it this time by talking about some modern errors and mistakes. Some things that I read and see and hear that are just not true. So let's call them out and let's fix this. Number one, let's be clear. People who say that nobody knows who the Western Emperor was, that's categorically false. The Western Emperor was Kumano-Mio Tenno. Okay, so the Kumano-Mio Tenno was the Western Emperor. That's the line that would eventually become the Kumazawa. That line is the Western Emperor line. Done. There's ample evidence. Anybody who tells you there's no evidence just has not researched, has not looked. Ample evidence. 2. Many modern historians claim that the emperor executed by the Ashikaga was just a prince with no verifiable connection to the Southern Emperor, or to Ogura no Miya, the emperor. This emperor, who you see here, Emperor Ogura no Miya, this was a verified Southern Emperor, right? That's the Southern Emperor. And then the emperor who's killed by the Ashikaga shogunate when they drag him out and cut his head off, he was emperor at the time. He is verifiably the emperor of the time. That's the son of Emperor Ogura no Miya, and he's executed. But a lot of modern historians, for some reason, either they are poorly they haven't actually researched the topic correctly, or they are for some reason adamant about anti-Southern Court propaganda. I don't know, but they claim that prince was not the emperor, he was just a prince, and that he was no verifiable connection to the emperor. Now, the ridiculousness of that statement, though, is they acknowledge that he's a Southern Court prince, but then they say that there's no verifiable connection. But why would you verify that he was a prince? Like, even in the argument, there's a massive error in the argument, right? So how could he be the Southern Court? How could he be a Southern Court prince if there was no connection to the Southern Court emperor? That ridiculously doesn't make any sense. So let's just fix it. It's a false statement. It's not only a false statement, but the statement itself has a contradicting error within the claim itself. So let's be done with that. Ample evidence supports that this alleged prince was actually the emperor, and ample evidence has existed for hundreds of years that he was Ogura no Miya's son. That's the heir to Ogura no Miya. That's proven. That's what the actual records show. Some historians will also say that there is no evidence for the Southern Court after the Onin War. This is also categorically false. Again, I don't know if people just are not researching it or if they have some sort of anti-Southern Court propaganda, but this statement is false. There's the family documents of the Kumazawa, the Kusunoki documents, the Nojiri documents. Basically, there's other documents too, chronicles of this, records of this. There's so many documents that discuss what happens to the Kumano-Mio Tenno after the Onin War. So to say that nothing exists is just false, categorically, across the board false. Kumazawa Banzan, the famous author in the 1600s, he's very upfront with this information and his genealogy. His grandfather, Kumazawa Morihisa, who served the Shibata and then the Fukushima clans, his genealogy is also part of why he is a chief retainer of these clans. Even in the 1600s, people knew the Kumazawa were the heirs of the Ogura no Miya line via the Kumano-Mio emperor. So again, that's what the record actually shows. And finally, we'll just retrace back around to a point I made earlier. Historically, out of the modern times, but historically speaking, many Kumazawa have made it known. As I mentioned earlier, Kumazawa Morihisa served Fukushima Masanori as a chief retainer, and he was very open about his genealogy. It was a kind of a deal that Fukushima Masanori's chief retainer should be the Southern Emperor. It's kind of a deal. Kumazawa Banzan was so opposed to the Tokugawa shogunate because he saw the Tokugawa as being a second coming of the Ashikaga shogunate. Basically, the Tokugawa were acting exactly like the Ashikaga. They had become interchangeable in Banzan's eyes. Now, and Banzan is known to have produced multiple criticisms of the shogunate in his lifetime, eventually ending up in house arrest. It's also interesting to note that Kumazawa Banzan was also a known associate of Tokugawa Yorinobu and Yui Shosetsu, and barely managed to avoid getting arrested and executed during the fallout of Yui Shosetsu's rebellion. Now, this is important because Tokugawa Yorinobu is the one member of the family who ideally should have been shogun, because he was the one Tokugawa who actually really seemed to want to do the job correctly, but he was not the one in charge. Banzan was fine with him. Banzan was not fine with the people that were actually in charge, who, as far as Banzan believed, were doing the same thing the Ashikaga did, and that was just do the job horrible, right? Just messing it up at every turn. This is interesting too because Banzan's own great-grandfather, Kumazawa Heizaburo should have been a Southern emperor. He is valid and qualified to be a Southern emperor, but he actually died defending Tokugawa Ieyasu during Ieyasu's escape in Mikatagahara. So when Ieyasu is fleeing from Mikatagahara, it is actually Kumazawa Heizaburo who helps him flee. Now, Heizaburo dies before they get back to the fort. So if you are familiar with that, when he's leaving the battle, Ieyasu makes this famous retreat back to the fort. Heizaburo actually is with him initially, and has actually taken arrows for him, or shots, arrows or shots. I don't remember now if he's shot or stabbed or whatever, but he actually takes a hit for him, and he dies while they're fleeing. But the point is that Banzan's like, Heizaburo, someone who should have been the Southern Emperor, actually took a death basically for you Ieyasu, and he's very critical of Ieyasu's heirs who are not living up to their role of shogun. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations, but please be respectful.